Welcome to video 10.2a, reactions of alkanes. And you know, with organic chemistry, you either get it or you don't. In terms of accessing prior knowledge, sorry, I should have excluded alkenes from this because this PowerPoint used to include alkenes, but now it's going to be a little shorter and just cover alkanes. I've resequenced organic a little bit. My apologies. But what are alkanes? Alkanes are saturated. They are single bonds only. Might be a ring structure, but they are single bonds only. The key idea, big idea, essential idea, structure, bonding, and chemical reactions involving functional group interconversions are key strands in organic chemistry. This will be the big idea for quite a few of our videos as we focus on reactions and kind of breaking 10.2 apart to study different types of reactions. Our focus today, though, however, is alkanes and their low reactivity and their free radical substitution reactions and combustion, which we'll get to. Alkanes contain only relatively strong carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, and they are non-polar. Therefore, they will only react in the presence of a strong source of energy, strong enough to break these bonds. They are stable under most conditions and can be stored, transported, and compressed relatively safely. So we will focus on the two main types of reactions, which are combustion and substitution. So for combustion, my guess is we could do this without a whole lot of practice. So I'll go through this relatively quickly. Complete combustion produces CO2 plus H2O for any compound made of carbon, hydrogen, and maybe oxygen sometimes, although not for an alkane. And that compound is reacting with oxygen and it is producing carbon dioxide and water. So this is propane. So we balance the equation, we get 3 carbon dioxides and 4 waters in the reaction of 1 mole of propane with 5 moles of oxygen. That is complete combustion with plenty of oxygen. If I have a limited supply of oxygen, incomplete combustion can result in carbon monoxide and carbon, and sometimes some CO2. It depends on how much oxygen is present. So we might get some carbon monoxide and some water. If there's really limited supply of oxygen, we might only get carbon and water. So are you expected to know like how to predict whether it's some carbon dioxide, some carbon monoxide, only carbon monoxide, only carbon? The answer to that prediction question is no, you're not expected to predict those. But just to be aware that if I have more oxygen present, I'll get more CO2, and if I have less oxygen present, I'll get more carbon, and it's a bit of a continuum in between. So less oxygen present means I get more of what's on the bottom of this list. More oxygen present means I get more what's on the top of the list. And if I have plenty of oxygen, I'll get only CO2. Now the consequences of these reactions, carbon dioxide and water are both greenhouse gases. Carbon monoxide is a poisonous gas, not good. Unburned carbon, which is soot, can be released as particulates, which have a negative health effect on the respiratory system and can actually act as catalysts in forming smog. So there are some consequences to these 3 reactions. Now basically the rest of our video today will be about free radical substitution reactions. And then this application skill, which is explanation of the reaction of methane and ethane with halogens. And the halogens will mostly be chlorine and bromine, in terms of a free radical substitution mechanism involving photochemical homolytic fission. Photochemical means there's light present. Homolytic fission we will talk about in a specific example coming up in the next couple slides. So the general reaction is we have an alkane plus a halogen makes halogenoalkane and hydrochloric acid, or hydrogen chloride as a gas, in the presence of UV light. This UV light is key, and without it, the reaction does not happen. The reaction does not happen without the ultraviolet light because alkanes are quite non-reactive or unreactive. So here's a specific equation for methane with chlorine in the presence of UV light makes chloromethane plus hydrogen chloride. But we need to learn the mechanism. The mechanism will involve 3 steps. Step 1 is initiation. Initiation as a step requires ultraviolet light. Must have ultraviolet light. And what that ultraviolet light does is split the chlorine into 2 chlorine radicals. And a radical, to refresh your memory, a radical has an unpaired electron. And radicals are incredibly reactive. So as a little bit of a detail here, if we look at these as the lone pair of electrons on chlorine and the bonded pair of electrons, that bonded pair gets split, and each chlorine gets 1 electron from the bond, and so the chlorines that are made are the same, and so that is called homolytic fission. Because this bond that's here was split equally. Homo as a prefix means same, so these 2 chlorines are the same, and they're called radicals because they have an unpaired electron. Initiation requires ultraviolet light, and it produces radicals. And it is photochemical homolytic fission. Here's a little bit of arrow pushing. When we use arrows, the arrows are showing the movement of electrons, and so this arrow represents one of these 2 electrons joining this chlorine, and this arrow represents one of these 2 electrons joining that chlorine. I'm going to be honest with you, I prefer the arrows to kind of point towards the chlorine, and I didn't draw that very well. Let me try again. I prefer the arrows to kind of point towards the chlorine a little bit, whereas these seem to be pointing kind of into outer space or some other space. But the point is, 1 electron from this bond joins this chlorine, and 1 electron from this bond joins that chlorine. And we end up with homolytic fission. Photochemical means it requires light. This fission will not occur without light. Ultraviolet light, to be specific. So the radicals are produced, and then the radicals that are produced are very reactive. So if this chlorine radical happens to bump into a methane molecule, it'll pluck a hydrogen atom from that methane, and you end up with a methyl radical. So propagation has a radical in the reactant side and a radical in the product side. So it is still reactive. And the reaction will propagate to continue and move forward. That methyl radical that is formed might hit a Cl2 that hasn't been split yet, because of ultraviolet light doesn't split all of them instantaneously. And if that methyl radical happens to hit a chlorine, it's going to pluck a chlorine and make one of the products. So this is a product. HCl is a product. Methyl chloride, or chloromethane, is actually the better name for it. That is one of the main products. But notice that there's still a radical here. So this is still reactive. And this is called propagation. So that chlorine radical, if it happens to bump into a methane, can continue the cycle. But what if that chlorine radical bumps into a molecule that's already the main product and makes another radical? CH2Cl radical. Well, that CH2Cl radical can make dichloromethane. And this is called a side product. So that means that these are the main reactions. And when I say main reactions, the most important reactions, the concentration of this chloromethane will be significantly lower than the concentration of methane, certainly initially in the reaction. And so these side reactions are not as likely. However, if they do occur, they produce a side product. And that's one of the messy things about organic chemistry. Sometimes side products are formed. But the key to propagation is a radical is used and a radical is formed. So there's still a very reactive species in the mixture. And this keeps the reaction going. Every time I use a radical, produce a radical, use a radical, produce a radical, use a radical, produce a radical. This radical can rejoin the cycle and the cycle can continue. And the cycle will continue until we hit a termination step. The termination step could be two chlorine radicals bumping together to make Cl2. Now, if UV light is still present, then that Cl2 can be split into the Cl radicals. And so the process will continue. If the UV light has been turned off, then this will terminate the reaction. If I have a methyl radical bump into a chlorine radical, that'll make one of the main products. And that's a good thing. If a methyl radical happens to bump into another methyl radical with the proper orientation, it might make ethane. Ethane is a side product. So again, it's a little bit of a messy reaction. The concentration of methyl radicals will likely be relatively small, but the possibility exists that it will make a side product. Now, in terms of this reaction, the reaction will continue until all of the chlorines have been added to an alkyl group and added to the alkane, or until the UV light is turned off and then all the reactions terminate. So if I keep the UV light on indefinitely, then it will react until all the chlorine is used up and it happens to hit one of these alkyl groups and make the alkyl the halogenoalkane. So let's clarify that now. The reaction will continue as long as I keep the UV light on. The reaction will continue until all the halogens have been added to the alkanes to make the halogenoalkanes. Because if this termination reaction happens and UV light is still present, then this chlorine will be broken apart. And I'm going to show you a video of this reaction, a demonstration of this reaction. Although it's using hexane instead of methane, the process is the same. And it's using bromine instead of chlorine, but again, the process is the same. I'm going to show you a video of this reaction and you can see it happen over time. It's a time lapse because it took like 20 minutes. Slow reaction. The key to termination is that two radicals combine and are used up. And so it removes the reactive species from the mixture and it terminates the reaction. Again, unless the ultraviolet light is still present. But once all the chlorines have been added to the alkanes, the reaction is done even if the UV light is still present. Now I have one more look at this reaction using methyl propane and some arrows just to kind of clarify a little bit. This comes from a particular website listed down here, free radical halogen substitution. This is homolytic fission of the chlorine-chlorine bond. It only occurs in the presence of UV light. This HV, it would look like that. H Planck's constant times frequency. It stands for ultraviolet light. Now, this is not methane or ethane, this is methyl propane, but this chlorine radical might pop this hydrogen off. And so now I have the the alkyl radical. This is the methyl propane, but it's now in radical form. So that radical might bump into a chlorine and pluck a chlorine to make the main product. And now we have the Cl radical. So the process can continue. This particular arrow pushing mechanism does not show any side products forming yet, and that's fine. It kind of focuses on the main reactions. The arrows here give a little bit more detail about what's happening with the electrons. A single-headed arrow means one electron. So this one electron is joining this chlorine, and one of the electrons from this bond is going to that chlorine. And so one of these electrons is staying with this chlorine. Because remember that this bond is worth 2 electrons. So this electron actually stayed with the chlorine. I don't need an arrow because we don't really think of that as moving, but we use an arrow for the other electron because this chlorine is going to leave. It's going to leave the molecule. In terms of termination, this one does give a side product in termination. If two of the alkyl radicals combine, we will get a side product. If the alkyl radical bumps into a chlorine radical, we will get one of the main products, or two chlorine radicals bump into each other, we get chlorine. Again, if there is still UV light present, then that will be used up. So an understanding is that alkenes are more reactive than alkanes and undergo addition reactions. Bromine water can be used to distinguish between alkenes and alkanes. And this syllabus statement will become much more important in our future video. But for today, it's a little bit relevant because what we just observed is if I have hexane and bromine water, and this is actually the reaction that I'm going to show you in a video, a separate video. In the presence of UV light, the bromine color, the brownish color of the bromine, will disappear as the bromine is added to the alkane. In the dark, it would just stay brown or brownish. And this reaction we can compare to alkenes, which we will learn about later. Must have ultraviolet light in order for this reaction to proceed. Checkpoint question time. Which species reacts most readily with propane? Species, which individual species, individual particle? It is the bromine radical. Bromine is really not very reactive with propane unless there is ultraviolet light present, and ultraviolet light makes the radical, and it is the radical that is reactive. And that's why it is the bromine radical that answers the question. So as a summary, due to their strong bonds and nonpolar nature, alkanes are not very reactive. Alkanes can be burned through complete or incomplete combustion, and alkanes can react with halogens in the presence of UV light to produce halogenoalkanes and actually I shouldn't say HCl, I should say HX, I apologize about that, by a free radical mechanism. And that's our summary. And that means we have reached the end of the video. Thank you for listening. This is reaction or video 10.2a, and let's get your answers to the checkpoint question onto the Google form. You can ask any questions, you can provide feedback on the video. Thanks again, have a great day. See you in class.